Welcome back to SuperString. Today I will show you a thrill ride, science fiction film from 2018, named Elizabeth Harvest. Spoilers ahead. Keep an eye out and fare thee well. In a vehicle ride through the mountains, Elizabeth awakens subsequent to dreaming she would observe a splendid man that would bring her into their very own mysterious universe. That man is the one driving, Dr. Henry Kellenberg, her new spouse. Whenever they come to his home, he acquaints her with the worker Claire Stratton and his child Oliver, who is visually impaired. Then, at that point, they have a colossal supper prior to resigning to their room to partake in their most memorable night as a wedded couple. The following morning, Henry shows her around the house, which has many rooms. These rooms have an exceptional lock that must be placed by filtering your thumb, and they're totally customized to perceive both Elizabeth's and Henry's. There's one room she isn't permitted to enter nonetheless, and Henry makes her guarantee she will not prior to getting going with her in that general area in the lobby, which Claire sees. Afterward, Henry tells her he'll leave first thing since work calls. The following day, Elizabeth is drawn closer by Claire to get some information about lunch. She takes this risk to get some information about Henry, since she's seen his Nobel Prize, and presently she asks why such a splendid man would wed a straightforward lady like her. Claire essentially answers she doesn't be aware prior to leaving. At the point when sun sets, Elizabeth can't resist the urge to see through the window that Claire and Oliver are going out around midnight. Regardless of how enthusiastically she attempts, Elizabeth can't rest, so she at long last goes to see what is inside the prohibited room. There, she discovers a lab with a bunch of bizarre machines of some sort. She opens one of these machines and is stunned to find a resting body inside it that closely resembles her. Going ballistic, Elizabeth runs out of the room subsequent to finding a plate, which makes her get a cut on her finger. In the wake of putting a bandage on the cut, she attempts to settle on a telephone decision, however the line is dead. In the end, she nods off and doesn't awaken until early afternoon. The following day, Elizabeth can't resist the urge to feel abnormal around Henry. In the wake of discussing their days, Elizabeth enlightens him regarding the telephone, and Henry answers it's extremely normal for it not to work around there. Consequently, he gets some information about the finger, so she says it was only a mishap before he takes her to their room to go the entire day in bed. Elizabeth abhors it and winds up crying. Around midnight, Henry gets up and Elizabeth follows him. She scarcely will arrive at the steps when Henry observes her and tells her she'll must be rebuffed for having resisted him. Then he uncovers a blade and starts pursuing her around the house. Elizabeth attempts to get out, however the locks will not acknowledge her thumb any longer. She stows away in the wine basement, which Henry enters then leaves when he doesn't see her, going to stand by in the family room. Whenever Elizabeth at last comes out, she observes the lounge unfilled, so gets a fire poker and attempts to go higher up, however Henry has taken cover behind them. He gets her lower leg to make her slip, then emerges to kill her with the blade. The following morning, Claire and Oliver assist him with covering the body in the forest before them three eat together like equivalents. Claire requests Henry to shut down this before he gets found out, yet he denies. In the early evening, he's visited by his companion Frank Logan, an investigator. Subsequent to letting him know Elizabeth is resting, Henry asks Frank what's disturbing him, and Frank admits he's concerned in light of the fact that his specialty is being explored for having acknowledged settlements. Plane has been saved, yet a portion of his companions haven't, and he'll need to affirm against them. Henry's just solution for this is that it's smarter to be the torturer than to be tormented, which Frank sees as freezing. In the interim, Claire is thinking of her diary when she's intruded on by Oliver, who has brought her a few blossoms. Claire turns them down and requests that he quit bringing her gifts, however Olive asks her for what good reason she stays, assuming she is so troubled. She says this is on the grounds that she knows things, yet Oliver thinks she stays since she adores him. In the wake of sending him away, Claire takes her pills. A month and a half later, in a vehicle ride through the mountains, Elizabeth awakens in the wake of dreaming she would observe a splendid man that would bring her into their very own mysterious universe. Her wedding dress is different, however the routine is something similar. Henry acquaints her with the family, shows her around the house, while Claire watches from a far distance, makes her guarantee she will not go into the taboo room, and after supper and moving, they go through their most memorable wedded night together. Before they nod off, Henry lets him know he'll need to leave next for business-related reasons. Elizabeth in any case can't rest, so she goes to the kitchen, where she observes Claire smoking. She tells her she needs to find out about Claire herself, however when Claire is going to tell her something, they're interfered with by Henry, who returns her to the bed. The following morning, Elizabeth gets herself alone in the house. In the wake of meandering around for some time, she at last yields and goes into the illegal room. She finds the duplicate of herself in the machine and takes off, yet this time, the case opens and the other Elizabeth comes out and pursues her. The duplicate observes Elizabeth dozing, so subsequent to checking through the window that Claire and Oliver are gone, she continues to finish Elizabeth's face and pull up her pajama top. The following day, Elizabeth awakens around early afternoon once more and winds up with her garments pulled. Henry views as her and inquires as to whether she's fine, so she goes to the washroom to wash. Henry attempts to follow her, however, regardless of how diligently Elizabeth attempts to keep the entryway shut, Henry comes in at any rate and gets a towel. While hearing him say she's ignored him, Elizabeth attempts to take off, yet Henry rapidly makes her fall and starts stifling her with the towel. After some battling, she figures out how to start him off prior to running once more, just to observe that the leave entryway lock will not acknowledge her thumb. Since the windows are additionally strong, Elizabeth hurries to the kitchen to get a few blades while Henry pours a sedative on a piece of fabric. Then, Henry goes to the lounge room to play the piano, then, at that point, he leaves a recording playing to make Elizabeth believes it's still him. The arrangement works. She leaves her concealing spot in the kitchen and Henry shows up behind her, setting the material against her nose and mouth. Elizabeth battles against him until she nods off, yet it turns out it's every one of the stratagem to make him bring down his defenses. She before long wakes up and tosses her arm behind her, cutting Henry and actually killing him. The two of them tumble to the floor, and as Henry drains out, the sedative kicks in and Elizabeth nods off. At the point when she gets up hours after the fact, she hauls Henry's body to the entryway and attempts to utilize his fingers to open the lock, however it won't work. Next she cleans the floor, covers Henry's body with his coat to conceal it, washes up and takes her wedding band off, then, at that point, consumes her horrendous nightwear. Afterward, she's snoozing on the lounge chair when she's unexpectedly awoken by a ringing telephone. It's Henry's Versatile, which shows many lost calls from Claire. Elizabeth calls 911 and lets them know she's secured in her own home, yet she doesn't have a clue about the location. Tragically, before she can give them any more data, Claire and Oliver return, so Elizabeth hangs up and professes to have been perusing from the beginning. The pair is stunned to track down her there and, surprisingly, more astonished to hear her say Henry is higher up resting. This makes Claire extremely apprehensive, so she scarcely will stroll into the kitchen before she has a respiratory failure. She figures out how to call 911 with her own telephone prior to dropping, and an emergency vehicle comes to get her before long. Elizabeth needs to utilize that opportunity to leave as well, yet Oliver stops her, telling her that assuming she leaves, he can't shield her from the police. He realizes Henry is dead and accepts Claire when she says she did it with good reason. In any event, discussing the mysterious world expression she imagined about before, he requests that she show him where the body is. Together they take it to the incinerator, where Oliver asks Elizabeth inquiries about her past. At the point when she was a youngster, she was debilitated a ton in the clinic. Her folks passed on in an auto collision, and she was raised in a shelter. Oliver tells her those recollections occurred in the other house close by where he and Claire rest. She was there until age 8. While Claire would be better at making sense of this, since she was essential for the investigation, Oliver actually attempts, so he tells her she's been cooked in the prohibited room like an egg. 6 indistinguishably hereditary duplicates were made, and she is number 5 of the Elizabeth gather. At that point, they see Frank's vehicle coming, so Oliver rapidly gives her a data to deal with it. Elizabeth has met him before once, and Henry made sense of her not being around much by saying she had a rest issue. She gets Frank in the lounge, letting him know Henry is resting in light of the fact that he wasn't feeling great. While Oliver goes to get them some water, Frank inquires as to whether she's alright in light of the fact that he's caught wind of the call she made to 911. Oliver returns and lets him know it was Claire that called when she had the coronary episode, a falsehood Elizabeth obliges. As Oliver passes on the space to get something different, Frank brings up how unusual it is everybody in this house has an issue, Elizabeth and her rest problem, Claire and her powerless heart, Oliver is visually impaired, and presently Henry isn't feeling great by the same token. In any case, he unexpectedly falls dead when Oliver returns with a rifle and fires him. He clears up for Elizabeth that Henry has been taking care of Frank since he got one more Elizabeth and brought her back home 3 a long time back. Henry killed that Elizabeth as well, as he did with each clone up to now. After Elizabeth turned 8, she was returned to the tank, which is the reason she has a hole in her memory. She would just be brought out for non-intrusive treatment and to fill her psyche with recollections and occasions, additionally to modify her character. Yet again Elizabeth needs to hear not any more about the investigation. Along these lines, she assists Oliver with taking the body to the incinerator. A while later, Oliver advises her to get a pack with garments and some cash from the protected prepared so Elizabeth can get away. Before she can leave in any case, he requests that she read Claire's diary since he can't and needs some important data from that point, then, at that point, continues to secure Elizabeth until the perusing is finished. Seeing as she has nothing else to do, she starts perusing the diary to figure out how everything began. Everybody knew about Henry's forward leaps in cell examination, and he resigned an extremely rich person in the wake of licensing some vital cell processes. A long time back, out of nowhere, he welcomed Claire to his home. He had some awareness of her work in neurodegeneration, so presently he believed that her should work for him. He took her to the illegal room and showed her the clones he made of his significant other, Elizabeth, who passed on while bringing forth Oliver of an exceptionally intriguing type of Werner syndrome. Henry took her DNA and cloned her, figuring out how to make 6 indistinguishable duplicates, yet the initial 2 previously showed intricacies upon entering the world it rapidly passed on, so he chose to place the other 4 into cryogenic rest until somebody tracked down a fix. That was Claire's work. She declined at first in light of morals, yet Henry immediately persuaded her whenever he made sense of the exceptional logical open door she would have. After 2 years, Claire figured out the code, so they started dealing with placing recollections into the clone's psyche. The third Elizabeth awakened genuinely solid, yet in addition bewildered and unfit to recollect things for a really long time. Days after the fact, Elizabeth found the gather room and took off. That was when Frank viewed as her. He returned her to the house, where they imagined she was Claire's niece who had mental issues. All things considered, Frank needed to fill in a report, so Henry took care of him to stay quiet about everything. At that point, Oliver intrudes on her understanding when he approaches bring her some food. He is sorry for having locked her, yet he guarantees they're on a similar side. Elizabeth actually hops on him when he opens the entryway and asks her for the entryway code prior to tying him up with his own belt so he can't get away. She gives the code a shot the entryway, yet Oliver had been lying, and when she goes to keep an eye on him, he had previously gotten away. In the wake of coming by the kitchen to get a blade, Elizabeth goes to the reap room, where she observes Oliver giving the last clone non-intrusive treatment to keep her alive. He swears he'll release her after she wraps up perusing the diary, then when she draws nearer to take a gander at the clone, she makes it lights out time for her by infusing some sedative on her neck. Subsequent to dreaming about what both her and different clones went through, Elizabeth awakens in her room, tied to the furnishings, and with some food left by Oliver. Attempting to get the chain off is inconsequential, so she returns to perusing the diary. Whenever Frank had been paid off, Henry and Claire went on with their tests, yet a couple of days after the fact, the third Elizabeth passed on from suffocation. Henry said he tracked down her face down on the pads, however Claire didn't trust him, yet she actually posed no inquiries. Subsequent to finding her condition had returned, they covered her in the forest prior to returning to doing more research. A half-year passed until they depleted each mix, so now that Henry was begun to lose trust, Claire at last took the plunge and went through the night with him. After they were done, Henry said he needed to switch off the machines since they weren't working, in spite of the fact that Claire disagreed. Back in the present, Oliver brings more food and offers Elizabeth a trait of data. Elizabeth lets him know Claire never specifies him and that she began an undertaking with Henry after she neglected to decipher the code, however Oliver amends her. She never fizzled, Henry adulterated the examples. Consequently, Oliver tells her that indeed, she's relieved and that every one of the clones lived there at 8 while he had been away and live in school. He returned when he was 12 and met the subsequent Elizabeth, who he believed was the prettiest individual since he wasn't visually impaired in those days. They immediately became companions, however Henry couldn't stand it, so in that frame of mind of envy, he went after Oliver in his rest and made him blind. Subsequent to referencing how he loathed seeing Henry and Elizabeth together, he leaves the room, so Elizabeth returns to perusing the diary. Claire separated the issue when she understood she would never supplant Elizabeth, who Henry wouldn't quit discussing. Whenever she asked him what he truly needed, he conceded he needed to remember his wedding night again and again, to encounter that elation once more. From the outset, Claire would have rather not helped him, yet since she was unable to force herself to leave possibly, she wound up helping with rejuvenating Elizabeth IV. While chipping away at her body, she referenced how she would never observe records of Elizabeth conceiving an offspring and inferred Oliver was a clone of Henry's, to which Henry answered that he generally stressed Elizabeth would need the little youngster she fell head over heels for, not this more established form. Current Elizabeth is excessively annoyed about this news and leaves the diary for some time. Following 2 days of not being near, Oliver awakens her with scissors on her neck and a draining hand, declining to make sense of where he had gone. Elizabeth continues to let him know the data he needs. Claire thought he was a clone, yet Henry showed her the birth endorsement and settled on her decision as specialist, so Olive is Henry's child and presently he can be anything he desires. Not knowing how to deal with these realities, Oliver gets off her. However, Elizabeth has speculated he cherishes her, so she persuades him to draw nearer while promising they can be together at this point. When he moves toward her, she drives him away, removes the scissors and the key for the chain, and requests the genuine entryway code. At the point when she angrily starts kicking him, she's out of nowhere hindered by the sixth and last Elizabeth clone, who has the rifle with her, is wearing a wedding dress and calls Oliver Henry. Elizabeth 5 attempts to tell her Oliver is the troublemaker, yet 6 accepts him over her and makes her drop on the floor, allowing her the opportunity to recuperate the scissors and cut Oliver's leg with them. Then, at that point, she gets Oliver as a prisoner, yet this isn't to the point of halting Elizabeth 6, who fires the rifle, killing Oliver and harming her past clone. Elizabeth 5 surges out of the room, lastly opens the entryway with the right code, yet when she ventures outside, Elizabeth 6 appears and shoots her once more. Prior to passing on, 5 advises her to peruse Claire's journal to know reality. Subsequent to washing and changing into new garments, Elizabeth 6 chooses to peruse the diary while eating. The night Henry killed Elizabeth 4 with the blade, Claire had heard her shout and went to see what was happening. Rather than making sense of, Henry told her he's revamped her agreement and changed the name on the entirety of his resources, so they had a place with Claire now, that way she could proceed with her examination. Claire took steps to call the police, yet Henry brought up no one would accept her since Elizabeth was at that point passed out. She had given herself to Henry in marriage, and afterward she kicked the bucket. However, presently she brought him happiness out of the compass of the law by allowing him to kill her again and again. He felt no disgrace about it on the grounds that these duplicates never felt like the genuine Elizabeth. Claire requested that he stop, and Henry vowed to make an honest effort. Back in the present, Claire returns from the medical clinic and catches Elizabeth at the entryway, who has a gathered sack all set. She gives Claire the diary and tells her she's brought in the house and the cash, so she better accomplishes something great with it. Then she leaves, at long last free and conscious from all that had been forced into her head.